So in this video series I'm doing a quick mini series on PLA smoothing. I've got a few good tips and tricks that I like to use when smoothing PLA, and that is to basically decant high build primer into a jar, because I prefer to apply it with a brush, as I find this gives me more ability to manipulate it over the layer lines in 3D print. I haven't tried this stuff out yet, but bear in mind in future I'm going to be moving on to a two-part automotive high build primer, just because it's cheaper than buying endless rattle cans. But for this video I'll show you guys my technique for decanting this stuff and the steps I take to apply it with a brush to smooth the PLA part. Keep in mind these prints are horrid, they came out terrible. I'm struggling with heat out in the shed at the moment. It's too hot. The cold side of my hot end can't keep up. I've got too much heat coming up the heat break. So it's not totally jamming up, but I'm getting really inconsistent extrusion from it. So it's a good and a bad thing. It's sort of a good example for PLA smoothing, but just bear in mind it's showing more work than it needs to be, because they are terrible prints. So I've let the high build primer sit on a bench for 24 hours overnight, and then I've just gently moved it into this box, and I've lightly punctured a hole in the top of the can with a Stanley knife. So now I'm just going to vent out the accelerant and all the other gases out of the can. And I'm doing this in a safe area, away from any ignition sources, and I've got a respirator on and some gloves as well. So now that the can is vented, now what I'm going to do is take a pair of tin snips, and I'm going to tin snip the top of the can off, and I'll pour it into this container that I've got. I would prefer a proper paint container. If you can find a glass jar with a real seal on it, it's always better than just using a peanut butter jar. But for now this is all I've got, and it seems to be working fine. And then once I've tin snipped the top of the can off, obviously I just pour it into the jar, and I also get a paintbrush and try and scrape out the rest of the high build that's sitting in the bottom of the can. The high build you're scraping out of the bottom of the can typically comes out of these cans sort of dry and clumpy, sort of like mashed up Play-Doh, and it seems like it wouldn't work, but it does. When you mix it in with the paint, it sort of dissolves back down again. You kind of really learn when you do this just how much you have to shake these cans up to get all this high particulate matter that's in the paint to actually mix properly. Yeah, you really want to, if you're going to use it out of the spray cans, you really want to shake the living crap out of these cans. So otherwise it's just going to be sitting on the bottom of the can and you're just basically spraying primer. And some people, when they do this, they'll leave the lid off the jar and let any other accelerants or gases come out of the paint. I don't personally bother. Once I've decanted it all, I just put the lid on and leave it ready to use it, basically. So that's my process for decanting high build primer. And obviously next up I'll be applying it with a brush. I've also put the rattle can ball into this jar as well. So now that I've decanted my high build primer, I'm just going to prepare this piece by knocking down any high spots, Z-hopping and stringing with an 80 grit nail file, some 120 grit sandpaper and my deburring tool. So now that I've prepared the piece, I didn't go too overboard on it. I just knocked down the high spots and got it ready. I prefer to just knock these high spots down and then get into it with a primer and then start sanding that. So what I'm doing is I'm mixing the primer really well to try and mix up all that particulate that'll be sitting in the bottom. And then once I've got it really well mixed, I'll just pour a little bit out at a time into a small container because it goes off unbelievably quickly. And this means you can just sit there in a small container and stir it and let it thicken up. So far I've found, hands down, this to be the best way of smoothing 3D print layer lines, because it lets you manipulate the material over the layer lines in the 3D print, and you don't lose all your detail. You don't lose all your detail. You can build it up in areas where you need to and still maintain your detail. And because it's high build primer, it just sands like butter. It just sands beautifully. So this is my #1 technique for smoothing PLA.
How much money can you stack in the deck? It's getting rough, collect calls from my niggas and I recollect we used to ball, now just living's enough. I stay tall in the winter, summer, spring, and fall. The for life, sprawled all across the world and all. I buy my dogs from my niggas and I recollect we used to ball, now just living's enough. I stay tall in the winter, summer, spring, and fall. The for life, sprawled all across the world and all. For my dogs, for my
talking out loud. Put your business in the street, talking out loud.
How much money can you stack in the deck? It's getting rough. Collect calls from my
So it's taken roughly 4 coats. I've brushed on high build primer, and you can see on the piece in front of me that there's a lot of areas that have had to have been filled out. This was a particularly bad print. Normally only takes 2 or 3 coats to get them smooth. So after brushing on the high build primer, I'm now spraying on a coat of high build primer on top of that. I'm going to wet sand this down with some 1200 grit, wet and dry sandpaper, and some soapy water. I'll wet sand this down, and then I'm going to airbrush the piece with some gloss white paint that I've decanted with the same steps as the high build primer. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and don't forget to like, share, comment and subscribe.